There are men who spend their whole lives building things that will outlast them: barns, fences, empires made of paper and ink and other people's labor. They build and never once stop to ask what their buildings are standing on. Never stop to wonder what they cost the ground beneath them. Caleb Stone was that kind of man. He had been that kind of man for 30 years, and on the night of June the 3rd, 1889, he stood at a second-floor window in his 14-room house in Santa Fe and looked down at a party happening in his own parlor that not one person inside it knew belonged to him. 15 people, good clothes, good whiskey, the sound of laughter rising up through the floorboards like smoke. Tom Reeves, his ranch manager of 4 years, had organized the dinner on Caleb's behalf, the way Tom organized everything on Caleb's behalf, the way the whole of Stone Ranch had been organized for a decade and a half. Through intermediaries. Through signatures on documents Caleb reviewed from a distance. Through the clean and comfortable arrangement of never having to look directly at anything he had set in motion. He watched the party for a long time without moving. Not one face turned upward. Not one person thought to wonder who owned the house they were standing in. Why would they? To the world, Caleb Stone existed primarily as a name on contracts and a signature on letters of credit. He moved through the territory like weather moves through a valley. Everyone felt the effects. No one ever saw the source. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk. The brass key was where it always was. Right-hand drawer back corner lying on its side as though it had been carelessly dropped there, which was a lie. Nothing about how Caleb kept that key was careless. He had placed it in that exact spot 3 years ago and had never moved it. His hand knew the distance from the door to the drawer to the key, the way a man's hand knows the distance to his own heartbeat. He picked it up and held it in the center of his palm. Small, ordinary, the kind of key a person might use to unlock a garden gate or a supply room. Nothing about it announced what it actually was. In 1886, Stone Ranch pushed its eastern boundary further into the high country. The project required water, a lot of it. The site foreman had drawn up a proposal to redirect a portion of the Bear Creek headwaters, pulling the flow away from the lower valley and channeling it east toward the new pastureland. Tom Reeves had signed the authorization under the broad managerial authority Caleb had granted him. The paperwork had come across Caleb's desk as part of a monthly review bundle sitting between a cattle purchase agreement and a loan instrument from the Phoenix Bank. He had read the first page of each document and signed the bottom. There had been 20 other things on his mind that day. 6 months after the water moved, the drought began in earnest, and Caleb Stone finally sat down and read his own files with the attention they deserved. What he found was not comfortable. The natural flow into the lower Red Rock Valley had been reduced by 40%, not enough to cause a drought on its own, but enough to turn a difficult season into something much closer to catastrophe for the small operations at the valley floor. Farms that had survived lean years before, a way station, people whose names he did not know and whose faces he had never seen. He had held this same key in the same hand on the afternoon he understood what he had done. He had not gone. 3 years of not going. 3 years of carrying this piece of metal in his pocket like a man carries a debt he keeps meaning to settle, but always finds a reason to defer. He told himself the timing was wrong. He told himself it would create legal complications. He told himself that the drought would have been hard, regardless that natural conditions were the primary cause, that one man's decision in a meeting room in Santa Fe could not be blamed for the suffering of people 3 mountain ranges away. He had been a skilled self-convincer for 30 years. It was one of the qualities that had made him rich. But there is a point in a man's life, if he is honest at all, when the stories he tells himself stop working. When he lies down at night and the dark is too complete and too quiet for the usual defenses to hold. Caleb had been reaching that point slowly, like a man walking toward the edge of something he cannot see clearly until he is already there. He had a wife once who would have told him he had arrived at that edge 3 years ago and was simply refusing to look down. Eleanor had been dead 7 years. She had died in the spring of 1882 from a fever that took 4 days and left no room for argument. She had been 41. She had been, for the 16 years of their marriage, the only person who spoke to him the way a person speaks to someone they are not afraid of, which was the way she spoke to everyone, but which had felt in those years directed specifically at him. The 7 years since had been years of managing his own company, without anyone in the house to look at him in the evenings, with eyes that had no interest whatsoever in what he wanted to believe about himself. He had not, in those 7 years, found a reason to move the things she kept on the left side of the wardrobe shelf. The small wooden box, the folded letters, a pressed flower from the first year dried to a color that no longer resembled anything it had been when it was living. He stood looking at the shelf for a moment. Then he went to the wardrobe and took out clothes he had not worn since the early years. A work shirt, the collar frayed the fabric rough in the way that meant it had been washed many times by someone who could not afford to replace it. Canvas trousers faded from what had once been brown to something closer to the color of dried mud. Boots with worn-down heels, the left one resoled once with leather that didn't quite match the original. He put them on in front of the mirror. The man looking back at him was someone he recognized. Not the man he had become. The man he had been at 22, driving cattle north through dust storms with nothing in his pocket but a folded letter of introduction from a rancher who had given him 3 days of work and thought he showed promise. He reached back into the drawer and took the key, put it in the right front pocket of the canvas trousers where it had always ridden when he carried it. Then he added one more thing. From a small box on the shelf above the wardrobe wrapped in a piece of flannel, he took a ring. Copper, not gold. His mother had worn it every day of her married life until the morning she was buried with it on her finger, and before that his father had placed it on her hand in a church in West Texas with borrowed money in his suit pocket, and a look on his face that Caleb, even at 7 years old, had understood to mean that whatever happened next in this life, this was the thing that mattered most. He had taken it from her hand himself the morning after she passed. He wrapped it back in the flannel and put it in the left front pocket, the key on the right, the ring on the left. Then he went down the back stairs, out through the kitchen door, and into the night while the party in the parlor continued without any awareness that the owner of the house had just walked out of it. Nobody turned to look. The road south from Santa Fe into Red Rock Valley was not a road any longer in the usual sense of the word. It had been a main thoroughfare, once the primary route from the territorial capital down into the lower country wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without either driver holding his breath. But the new route had been cut through 3 years ago following the railroad grade, and the old road had been left to whatever the desert does to things that stop being used. What the desert does is reclaim them slowly and without apology. Caleb rode an unremarkable mare he had taken from the back stable, a horse with no distinguishing features and no particular registration that anyone would remember. The road under her hooves was cracked in long, irregular lines, like the skin of something that had gone too long without water. The saguaros stood on either side in the early heat like figures that had been watching the road for years and had given up expecting anything interesting to happen. He passed through the outskirts of Copper Ridge by mid-morning. Copper Ridge was the last town of any size before the lower valley, which meant it was not very large and had not been for some time. He needed water for the horse and stopped at the public trough on the main street. While the mare drank, he stood in the shade of the overhang and let the town look at him the way a town looks at a stranger it has no particular opinion about yet. 2 women came out of the general store across the street. Nice dresses, parasols, the kind of careful presentation that communicates, among other things, that the person making it has enough time and resources to care about such things. They were not young, but they were not old either. They were the age of women who have made something of their situations and know it. Caleb touched the brim of his hat as they passed. The nearer woman did not look at him. The farther one glanced across, held the look for perhaps half a second, and looked away. He heard her say something to her companion in a voice pitched low, but not low enough. And he heard the companion laugh, and the phrase he caught, the specific cluster of words, was not one that merited repeating. He stood and counted to 3. He was not angry. That was not why he counted. He counted because he wanted to fix the moment in his memory with precision. He wanted to know exactly what it felt like to be looked through, to be dismissed by a glance, to be reduced in someone's estimation to something barely worth commenting on and entirely not worth addressing. He wanted to know this because he suspected he was about to learn what the opposite felt like. And a man cannot fully understand a contrast if he only has one side of it. He wrote on. The sign appeared late in the afternoon, nailed to a post at the junction of the old road, and a dirt track leading east toward what looked like nothing much. The letters had been painted by someone who cared about legibility more than elegance. The sign itself leaned at an angle that suggested either the post had shifted or the person who put it up had been tired. Possibly both. Caleb turned the mare down the track. He saw her before he saw the building. She was kneeling in the dirt between rows of tomato plants, and the first thing he registered about her was not her face or her age or anything identifiable as a personal characteristic. The first thing he registered was her hands, the way they moved. She had a watering can in her right hand tilted at an angle that suggested it was nearly empty, and she was guiding the last of whatever was in it toward the base of a plant that even from 20 yards looked like it had already made its decision about which direction things were going. She was giving it water anyway. He stopped the mare. The woman looked up. Gray eyes. The kind of gray that is not uncertain or soft but clear. The way winter sky is clear. The way certain kinds of truth are clear when you stop trying to look around them. Her hair was white, pinned back from her face with the efficiency of someone who had decided a long time ago that hair existed to stay out of the way and had arranged matters accordingly. Her dress was calico washed so many times the pattern had faded from something deliberate into something that was now simply color general and approximate. She looked at him with no particular expression. Need something, she said. Water? I don't have a cent, he said. She studied him for a moment, not the way those women in Copper Ridge had studied him from above and at a distance with the purpose of categorizing and dismissing. She studied him the way someone looks at a situation they are trying to understand before they decide what to do about it. She was trying to know something about him. What she concluded apparently was sufficient because she set down the watering can, stood up from the dirt with the careful economy of someone whose body has opinions about how quickly such transitions should happen, and walked inside. The door swung shut behind her. Caleb waited. He was not accustomed to waiting for things. In his ordinary life, things were arranged in advance, anticipated, delivered on schedule. He gave instructions, and those instructions were carried out. He made decisions, and those decisions produced results. Waiting without knowing what the result would be was a sensation he had largely engineered out of his daily existence. It turned out to feel like standing at the edge of something. Not unpleasant exactly, just unfamiliar. The way the first cold morning of autumn feels unfamiliar, even though you knew it was coming. The door opened. She came out holding a tin cup. Dented on one side where something had struck it, the metal worn to a particular dull finish that comes from decades of use and washing. She held it out to him without ceremony, without performance, without the small theatrical additions that people make when they want you to notice that they are doing something generous. She was simply offering water to a person who needed it. He took it and drank. The water was cold and tasted of iron and something mineral and deep, and it occurred to him as he drank that he could not remember the last time he had tasted water this directly without the mediation of a proper glass or a filtered cistern or any of the other refinements that money makes possible and that quietly separate a man from the basic reality of things. He finished every drop. When he handed the cup back, she was still looking at him in that same clear, unhurried way, as if she had all the time in the world and intended to use a portion of it figuring out what kind of man was standing in front of her before she committed to any particular conclusion. I can work, he said. Fences, ditching, whatever needs doing. I don't need wages, just a place to sleep and meals. She looked at his hands. You dig like a man who hasn't held a shovel in 15 years, she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation stated flatly as a piece of information she was sharing so that he could take it into account. Maybe, he said. She paused at the doorway, her hand on the frame. What do I call you? She said. He thought for half a second, a name that was close enough to his own that he would answer to it without hesitation. Eli, he said. She nodded once, accepting this the way she accepted most things without ceremony, without the performance of hospitality. She stepped aside from the door. Supper's in an hour, she said. The kitchen was small and smelled of wood smoke and something warm and savory that had been cooking for a while. An oil lamp on the table put out a low amber light that softened everything without making anything unclear. 2 plates were set when she called him in, and the first thing he noticed was the disproportion. His plate was full. Beans, a generous wedge of cornbread, a few strips of dried meat arranged along one side. Her plate held considerably less. He had looked at the shelves when he washed his hands at the basin. The pantry behind the kitchen door was visible through the gap, and what was visible told him something he was not certain she intended him to know. a jar of molasses nearly empty, a cloth bag of cornmeal with very little left in it, some dried beans in a canister, not much else. She was giving him the larger portion of what she had. He did not say anything about it. He understood intuitively that she would not receive comment on the matter with any particular warmth. Some people give because they want to be thanked. Others give because giving is what they do, and making a ceremony of it is to their mind beside the point. Agnes Wheeler was clearly the second kind. He learned her name the way you learn things in a place like this, not through formal introduction, but through accumulation. She said it once at the end of supper, when she told him that the stable was his place, and that in the morning he would see what needed doing. Agnes Wheeler. She said it the way a person states a fact that is not open for elaboration. She refilled his plate, once midway through the meal, setting down an additional piece of cornbread with the matter-of-fact precision of someone completing a task they had already decided on. She did not look at him when she did it. She just placed it there and returned to her own food. He ate everything. Toward the end of this meal, his eyes went to the shelf near the window. A tin cup hung there on a small iron hook positioned apart from the other kitchen things separated from them in a way that suggested it was not part of the ordinary rotation of domestic objects, but something else, something kept for its own reasons. Henry's, she said without looking up from her plate. He had not thought he was being obvious about looking. He bought it with his first wages. She continued, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone telling a story they have told before in their own mind, at least many times. 16 years old, carpentry apprenticeship over in Durango, 4 cents at a fair. He told me afterward that he bought it because he wanted something he could hold in his hand and know he had earned. Nothing that came from anyone else, just the work and what it bought. She fell quiet. He was a good man, Caleb said. Not because he knew this to be true from evidence, but because the way she spoke about him made it clear. Yes, she said simply. She told him the rest without elaboration. Henry Wheeler had built the way station with his own hands before they married as a way of establishing something permanent in a territory where permanence was not easily achieved. He had died 80 years ago in the horse's stall on a Tuesday morning in October while saddling the mare for the day's work. His heart had stopped. The horse had stood beside him until Agnes came looking. She said this the way you say a thing you have said many times and have learned to say, without letting all of it come through your voice at once. After supper, she walked him out to the stable, a low building clean in the way that a person keeps things clean when cleanliness is a matter of discipline rather than resources. The mare he had arrived on was already settled at one end. A bed of straw was arranged at the other with a blanket folded on top of it. "This is your place tonight," she said. She did not apologize for it. She did not decorate it with any language about hoping he would be comfortable. She presented it as what it was. "Morning, you'll see what needs doing." She left. He stood in the dim stable for a moment, listening to the sounds of the desert evening starting up outside. The first calls of night birds. Something moving in the brush. The deep and particular silence that fills in around sounds in open country and makes the sounds themselves more distinct. Then he sat down on the straw and took the brass key from his right pocket and looked at it in the fading light. He had told himself he came here to look at what his decisions had cost someone, to put a face to what had been until now only a line item in a damage assessment. That was the version of the story he had brought with him on the road. But sitting in Agnes Wheeler's stable with the memory of a half-empty pantry shelf and a tin cup on a hook, and a woman who had given a stranger the larger portion of her last meal, he understood that his version of the story had been like many of his stories about himself, somewhat comfortable, somewhat self-serving, designed to cast him as a man engaged in a meaningful act rather than a man running toward an obligation he had been too afraid to face for 3 years. The next morning he found his shovel and went to work. He worked hard, and he worked honestly, and the only performance in it was the performance of starting from scratch, of pretending not to know things he knew, of moving more slowly on the unfamiliar tasks than his instincts required. The mule-drawn cultivator, the way water runs downhill and how a ditch needs to be cut to use that fact rather than fight it. He had known these things since he was younger than Daniel Webb was now. Agnes came out to check his work twice that first afternoon. The first time she looked at the trench he had opened along the garden's east side, she said nothing. Just looked, nodded once, and walked on. The second time, she walked the full length of what he had completed and paused at the far end where he had angled the channel toward the lowest point of the garden bed. "That's right," she said, "not generous praise, not the sort of thing that builds a man's confidence in himself, just confirmation that what was done correctly." He found to his own surprise that this was more satisfying than praise would have been. Late that afternoon, while he was replacing a section of fence on the northeast corner of the property, he stopped working for a moment and stood looking at the tomato plants along the back wall of the house. There were 23 of them. He counted. Each one had a small stake driven into the soil beside it, a thin sliver of cane tied loosely to the plant's stem. Most of the plants were not doing well. The leaves were yellowing. A number of them were bent at angles that communicated clearly that the structural situation was not favorable. Two or three had given up the upright position entirely and were simply lying along the ground, still technically alive, but not pressing the point. Every one of them had a stake. Someone had walked along all 23 of those plants and pressed a piece of cane into the dry ground beside each one and tied it in place with a piece of cord or a strip of cloth. It would have taken time. More time than you would spend on a project you had decided was hopeless. At Stone Ranch, the management practice for struggling plants was removal and replacement. You pulled the ones that were failing, turned the soil, and planted fresh seed. You did not invest labor in individuals. You managed the system. Agnes Wheeler was not managing a system, she was tending plants. The distinction felt important in a way he could not entirely articulate yet, but that sat with him through the rest of the afternoon in the particular way that things sit with you, when they are waiting for you to find the right frame for them. On the third day the children came. He heard them before he saw them, the sound of footsteps that were not trying to be quiet coming up the track from the south, and he was behind the stable when they came into view. Three of them. A boy in front, tall for his age, with the deliberate walk of someone who has taken on responsibility early and carries it in his body. A girl behind him moving at a slight distance as if she had her own orbit. A small boy at the back chasing his own shadow and losing. The older boy was perhaps 13. The girl looked to be 10 or so. The little one, the one with the gap-toothed smile and the untucked shirt and the complete absence of concern about either of those things, was maybe 7. Agnes came out of the house before they reached the door. And here is what Caleb saw watching from the shadow at the corner of the stable, where he had no particular reason to stop, but had stopped anyway. She knelt down. She went all the way down to the boy's level, to the level of the little one, and she put her arms around all three of them at once, and she held them in a way that was not casual, and was not brief, and was not the hug of a woman greeting the neighborhood children who stop by sometimes for a meal. It was the hug of someone who has been keeping a count of days between these moments and is making up for the accumulated distance. Her eyes were closed. He saw that clearly. Eyes shut, and something in the set of her shoulders that he recognized as a specific quality of a person allowing themselves to feel something they normally keep in a box in a room with the door shut. The little one, the gap-toothed one, had both arms around her neck and his face buried in her shoulder. The girl held on with her hands and did not let go until Agnes herself let go first. The older boy stood straight, received the embrace with the measured dignity of a 13-year-old who has taken on the responsibility of not being seen to need things too openly. But his hand came up and rested on Agnes's back briefly, and the steadiness of it suggested that this was not the first time he had put his hand on someone's back when they needed steadying. Agnes brought them inside. He went back to his work, but he did not stop thinking about what he had seen. He thought about the way she'd introduced them to him later, when he came in for water, when he'd asked carefully who came by regularly. Neighborhood children, she'd said. The Cooper family's kids down the road. Sometimes I give them a meal. Neighborhood children. He thought about the word sometimes and compared it to what he had just seen. The completeness of that embrace. The specific intimacy of it. The way the small boy went to her neck, the way children go to the necks of people who have always been there, who represent safety in the oldest and most fundamental sense. Then just before they left, he witnessed one more thing. He was close enough by then to hear, though Agnes did not raise her voice. She stood beside the older boy at the edge of the property, where the track bent south, and she pressed a small cloth pouch into his hand. The boy's hand closed around it automatically, the way hands close around things they have held before. "Don't let anyone see," she said. The boy nodded, not with surprise, with the nod of a person receiving instructions they have received before and know how to follow. They walked away. The little one turned back once and waved his whole arm in it, the wave of someone with no reserve about enthusiasm. Then they were around the bend and gone. Agnes stood watching the empty track for longer than she needed to. He had seen her give those children the food from her nearly empty pantry. He had seen her give him the larger portion of her own meal. He had held a small cloth pouch in his mind's eye and thought about what it weighed and what it cost her to fill it. He had moved $2 million across a ledger in a single transaction the previous March without feeling the weight of any of it. There was something deeply wrong with that comparison. He was not sure yet what to do with it, but he knew it was there. On the sixth day, Agnes asked him to bring the Bible from the shelf in the kitchen. He found it where she'd said it would be, a heavy book with a black cover worn soft at the corners, the kind of book that has been handled many times by the same hands over many years. He picked it up and an envelope slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. He picked it up. He was not trying to read it. But the handwriting on the front was clear and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that had been taught with care and had not been abandoned since. The name on the front was Dr. Harvey Morse, Red Rock, Arizona Territory, and below the name in the same careful hand, a single line of instruction, to be opened only after I am gone. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, then he slid the envelope back between the pages in the exact place it had come from and carried the Bible out to Agnes on the porch. She took it without looking up. He went back to the work he had been doing. But the words sat in him for the rest of the afternoon and followed him into the stable that night. They were still there when he lay down on the straw and pulled the blanket over him and listened to the night sounds outside the wall. To be opened only after I am gone. She was not simply sick, or rather she was not simply enduring sickness in the way that people endure things they hope will pass, making accommodations and adjustments while keeping the larger structure of their plans intact. She was managing toward an end she had already accepted. She had written a letter. She had sealed it. She had addressed it to the doctor, who presumably knew what the letter needed to explain. She was preparing. And yet, he had watched her spend the better part of that afternoon tending the tomato plants that were losing their argument with the drought, pressing the stakes deeper where the wind had shifted them, checking the ties with the same attention she would give to something that had a reasonable future. She was preparing to die, and she was still tending the garden. He lay in the dark for a long time with the key in one hand and the flannel-wrapped ring in the other, and he let himself think the thought he had been circling for 3 years without landing on it. He had done this, not as the sole cause, not as the only reason the valley was struggling, but as a significant and deliberate contributing factor that he had allowed to continue when he had the means to address it. He had put the key in his pocket and carried it like a man carries a letter he can't bring himself to mail. And all the while, 8 miles south of the Bear Creek diversion, a woman was filling cloth pouches with the last of her coins and pressing them into a child's hand with instructions not to let anyone see. The night was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the house, he heard Agnes cough. A dry sound, a sound with effort behind it, the effort of a body working harder than it should have to for a function it should not have to work for at all. He heard her cough again, then silence. Then the sound of her moving carefully the way someone moves when they are trying not to make noise that carries through the walls at night. A door, a lamp being turned down. He closed his hand around the key. He had told himself he came here to see a face, to make the damage real. That was not wrong exactly, but it was not the whole truth either. The whole truth was that he had come here because he had reached the point where the stories he told himself had stopped being enough, where the numbers in the ledger and the distance between his desk and the consequences of what he signed had stopped providing the cover they once had. He had not expected to find what he had found. He had not expected to find a woman who gave away things she could not spare, with no ceremony and no accounting and no expectation of return, who staked dying tomato plants and tended them as if the act of tending were its own justification independent of outcome, who had written a letter to be opened after her death and kept it inside the book she read every evening. He had come here carrying guilt. He was beginning to understand that what he carried was much less than what she carried, and that she carried hers without complaint and without putting it down. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would get up before dawn. He would saddle the mare. He would ride 3 miles north on the old utility track and unlock the Bear Creek valve station and open the main control wheel and let the water go where it had always been going before he signed a piece of paper that redirected it. He would do this in the dark before anyone was awake because he was not ready yet for what would come after. Because giving the water back was one thing. Explaining how it had been taken was another thing entirely, a larger and harder thing, and he was not ready to stand in the full light of that yet. But he would do it. Tomorrow, he would do it. He kept his hand closed around the key and listened to the desert night and did not sleep for a very long time. There was no conversation in which it was decided that Caleb would stay. No negotiation, no extended terms of employment discussed over the supper table. Agnes simply set 2 plates each morning and each evening, and the work that needed doing continued to present itself, and Caleb continued to do it. That was the whole of the arrangement, and it suited both of them in ways that neither would have been able to explain to someone who required things to be formal. They learned each other the way people learn the geography of a place they are going to be living in for a while. Not through direct inquiry, through observation, through the quiet accumulation of detail. He learned that she did not want anyone asking about her health, not in the concerned and hovering way, not in the matter-of-fact way, not in any way at all. If he noticed she was moving more slowly on a given morning, the appropriate response was to position himself near whatever she was trying to do and make himself useful without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing so. He learned this through the single sharp look she had given him, the one time he had asked early in the first week whether she was feeling all right. The look was not unkind. It was simply a very clear communication that certain territories were closed to general traffic. He learned that if he added food to her plate, when she turned away to tend the stove, she would eat it without comment. That if he brought extra wood in before she had to ask, she would set it in the box without acknowledgement, but also without the particular kind of silence that means a person has noticed and wishes you had not bothered. That in the late afternoons when the light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and turned the dust in the air into something that looked almost precious. She stood at that window and looked out at nothing in particular, and that time was hers and not to be interrupted. She learned that he worked past the point of reason if no one stopped him. That his hands went to his right pocket in the evenings when he sat outside the stable, reaching for something and then retreating repeatedly in a rhythm she recognized as the physical expression of a thought that keeps returning and keeps not being resolved. That he understood horses in a way that went beyond management into something more like communication, and that the mare responded to him with a willingness she did not always show Agnes herself, which Agnes observed without comment, but with an attention that suggested she was filing it away. They did not talk much. When they did, it was the talk of work, the mending of things, the planning of tech, the small assessments and adjustments that constitute the daily language of people whose primary shared project is keeping something alive. It was, Caleb thought, the most honest form of conversation he had engaged in for years. He thought about Eleanor sometimes in those first weeks, not with grief which had softened into something more like the ache of an old wound that only presents itself in certain weather. He thought about her with the specific clarity that comes when you are in a place that is new enough to make your history visible. She had been a plain-spoken woman from West Texas, the daughter of a man who built windmills and believed that useful things were more beautiful than decorative ones. She had told Caleb in the second year of their marriage that she had not expected to find a man who could make money and still be worth talking to, and that she intended to keep talking to him for as long as he gave her reason to. He had given her reason for 16 years. After she died, he had stopped talking to people. Not in the obvious way. He still held meetings, still dictated letters, still managed the necessary transactions of a life built at scale. But the talking that costs something, the kind where you say a true thing to another person and feel the weight of having said it, that had stopped. He had not noticed its absence in the way you notice a missing tooth. He had noticed it the way you notice after a long winter that you have forgotten what the light looks like when it comes through leaves. Agnes Wheeler was the first person in 7 years who had made him want to say true things again. He was not sure she would have believed it if he told her. He was not sure he would have believed it himself 2 months ago. But sitting in her stable at night with the key in his palm, he understood it clearly enough that it no longer required examination. On the second visit of the 3 children near the end of that second week, Caleb did not retreat behind the stable. He continued working on the fence section along the north perimeter, which put him in a position to be visible without being intrusive. The little one Eli detached from his siblings almost immediately and came across the yard in the particular way of small children who have not yet learned that approaching a stranger requires a certain amount of preliminary assessment. "Can you teach me to drive a nail?" Eli said. He said it with no preamble and no particular expression, just the open directness of a 7-year-old who wants a thing and has identified the most direct path to it. Caleb looked down at him for a moment. The gap in his front teeth, the untucked shirt, the completely undefended quality of the request. "Come here," Caleb said. He positioned the boy's hand on the hammer, found a straight nail, set it against the fence post, and showed him the motion. Not once, 3 times slowly, letting the boy feel the weight and the angle before he tried it himself. The first swing missed. The second hit the nail sideways and bent it. The third drove it half an inch into the wood. Eli looked at the result. He looked at it with the expression of someone who has just discovered something that is going to matter to him for the rest of his life. Lucy sat apart under the scrub oak at the garden's edge, drawing something in the dirt with a stick. She had not spoken to Caleb directly, but he had noticed that when she drew what was actually there. The house, the stable, the mending fence. Not imaginary things. She was the kind of child who paid close attention to the world and kept records of it in whatever medium was available. Daniel stood at a greater distance. He was not ignoring Caleb. He was watching him. There was a difference, and the difference was important. Ignoring is a passive act. What Daniel was doing was active, deliberate. The careful, long evaluation of someone who has been made cautious by experience and has decided that caution is a reasonable policy. When Agnes called the younger two inside for the meal, Daniel did not immediately follow. He waited until they had gone in, and then he came and sat on the low fence post, 10 feet from where Caleb was working. He said nothing for a while. Caleb kept working. "You're hiding something," Daniel said. It was stated as observation, not accusation. The same neutral precision his grandmother used when she told Caleb he was digging like a man who hadn't held a shovel in 15 years. Caleb set the hammer down. "What makes you think so, the way you work?" Daniel said. "You work like someone who's trying to prove something. People who just need the work don't work like that." 13 years old, Caleb looked at him and thought about the specific kind of vision that comes to children who have been asked to grow up quickly, the way it sharpens in some directions, while other things, softer things, get pushed out to make room. "Maybe you're right," Caleb said. "Does my grandmother know?" "I don't know what she knows." Daniel was quiet for a moment. He had a small folding knife in his hand, turning it over, not opening it. The kind of handling that was not about the knife at all, but about having something to do with your hands while your mind worked. "That was my father's," he said without Caleb asking. "He died when I was 9. My mother died 6 months after. Fever took them both inside of a year." He looked down at the knife. "My father told me that a good knife isn't the sharpest one. It's the one a man never leaves behind." "Your father was wise," Caleb said. Daniel nodded once. "Then are you going to stay?" The question was simple, and it was not simple at all. It contained inside its 4 words everything that the situation actually was: a boy who had lost the people he depended on, living at a distance from the one person who remained to him, watching a stranger work in his grandmother's yard, and trying to determine whether this stranger was one more temporary thing or something else. "I don't know yet," Caleb said. "But if I stay, I'll stay for the right reason." "What's the right reason?" Caleb thought about it honestly before he answered. "The kind that means you won't feel tricked in the morning." Daniel processed this. It took a moment. Then he gave a slow, serious nod, the nod of someone who has received a piece of information they are going to hold on to and test against events as they unfold. "My grandmother has had enough people leave already," Daniel said. He stood up from the fence post, still turning the knife in his hand. "Don't be one more." He went inside without waiting for a response. He did not need a response. He had said what needed saying with the directness of a person who has learned that unclear communication is a luxury that circumstances have not offered him. Caleb watched him go and understood that he had just passed through the most honest evaluation of his situation that anyone was likely to give him, and that the evaluator had been a boy with a borrowed knife and a grief older than his years. The drought grew worse through the back half of June. The well dropped another 2 feet, which Agnes measured each morning with a knotted cord she kept hanging on the well post for exactly this purpose. The water she drew up came up darker, more mineral, with a thickness to it that was not quite right. She did not comment on this. She used it carefully, prioritizing the kitchen and the animals in the last of the garden, stretching it with the disciplined efficiency of someone who has done the math and knows how much is left and what it has to cover. The days had a quality that Caleb had not experienced since the early years when he was young and poor and working someone else's land, and the margin between getting through and not getting through was thin enough that you could see both sides of it clearly. He had forgotten what it felt like to watch the sky every morning with something at stake. He had forgotten the particular quality of attention that comes with scarcity, the way a person counts things, water and food, and days when counting matters. Agnes counted everything. He watched her do it without her appearing to. The cups of meal remaining, the level of the oil in the lamp, the state of each plant. She carried a running inventory in her head, the way a ship's captain carries one, not obsessively, but completely, because completeness was the only responsible approach to a situation where gaps in the accounting had real consequences. He found himself doing the same thing, which surprised him. At the ranch, he had managed at distance, through numbers and reports and quarterly summaries. The inventory of things was someone else's job. Here it was the only job. Caleb dug deeper into the existing trench along the garden's east side, driving the channel down through the hard-packed clay in the hope of reaching a lower water table. The earth here had the specific resistance of soil that has been dry for a very long time, the kind of dryness that goes all the way down through the layers and does not yield easily to a shovel. His hands bled and he did not stop. Agnes came out one afternoon and stood at the edge of what he had opened up, looking down. "That soil won't give water," she said. "You don't know that yet. I've lived here 25 years. I know." He did not put down the shovel. "And you've been staking tomato plants all week." A pause. "You dig like a man who owes me something," she said. He stopped, looked up at her. "Maybe." It was the most honest single syllable he had spoken since he arrived. He could see that she registered it as such. Her gray eyes held his for a moment, with a quality he was beginning to recognize as her form of attention at its most concentrated, and then she turned and walked back toward the house without another word. He went back to digging. That evening, a rider came up the track from the south at a pace that communicated purpose. Caleb was at the stable when he heard the hooves and looked out to see a man dismounting at the property gate. Older than Tom Reeves, 55, maybe 60, a leather bag over one shoulder, the kind of bag a doctor carries. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a person who has been coming to a place for a long time and knows every step of the path. Agnes came out of the house before he reached the door. "Harvey," she said. "Agnes." He looked past her toward where Caleb stood at the stable entrance. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at something he has not been informed about and is trying to assess quickly. It was not a hostile look. It was the look of someone whose job involves rapid evaluation of situations and who does not turn that habit off outside of professional hours. Agnes said something to him quietly. He nodded, transferred his attention back to her, and they went inside. The kitchen window was open on the south side. The window faced the stretch of ground where Caleb was splitting wood for the morning stove, and the angle of the late afternoon put him close enough that voices carried when they were not being deliberately suppressed. He was not trying to listen. But when the doctor's voice came through at a volume that suggested he had not accounted for the open window, Caleb stopped moving. "Agnes, when I spoke to you in March, I told you 9 months to a year. That was March. I know arithmetic, Harvey. It's June now. Your lungs are worse than they were. You need to rest more than you're resting, eat more than you're eating. There's not more to eat." A silence, the kind of silence that falls when a true thing has been said that neither person particularly wanted to hear. "I could arrange something. There are people in town who would. I don't want town people arranging things for me. I want to manage my own affairs in the time I have left to manage them." "How long in your own estimate?" A longer silence this time. "End of summer," she said. "Into fall, if I'm lucky." Caleb set down the axe. He stood in the late afternoon heat with the wood half split at his feet and did the arithmetic himself. June. End of summer was August. September at the outside. 2 months. 3 if fortune was operating at above average levels. He thought about the letter in the Bible. To be opened only after I am gone. The pantry nearly empty. the coins pressed into Daniel's hand, the stakes in the tomato plants. She was not planning for next spring. She was finishing the business of this one in the time she had with the resources available. He did not allow himself to stand still for long. He picked up the axe and kept splitting wood because standing still would have been visible through the window. And he did not want her to come out and find him frozen in the yard with the expression he was currently wearing on his face. When Dr. Morse came out, he did not get directly on his horse. He stood at the edge of the property and looked at Caleb steadily for a moment. Then he walked over. "She told me you came 3 weeks ago," he said, "that you've been working." "Yes." "She didn't tell me much more than that." "There's not much more than that to tell." The doctor looked at him the way he had looked at him before the rapid assessment. Up close, he was a man who had seen a great deal and had developed the specific stillness that comes from having processed most of what life tends to offer before it actually arrives. "I've known Agnes Wheeler for 20 years, he said. "She is the most privately courageous person I have treated in 32 years of practice. She does not accept help easily, and she does not ask for it at all." He paused. "What I can't give her in the time she has left is company that she trusts. That's not something medicine provides." He looked at Caleb for another moment. "I don't know who you are, and I'm not asking. But if you're going to stay for the right reason." It was almost word for word what Daniel had said. Caleb thought about that for a moment after the doctor rode out. Two people, one 13 years old and one 58, had told him the same thing with no knowledge that the other had said it. He was not sure what to make of that coincidence, except that it probably wasn't a coincidence at all. That when something true needs to be said, the people around you who are paying attention tend to say it, and the repetition is simply how the truth makes sure it's been heard. The next morning, two things happened in quick succession. He was working on the far end of the east fence line when he heard hooves on the track, and the pace this time was different from the doctor's. More deliberate, more official. He looked up and saw a man coming on a horse that cost more than anything currently on Agnes's property, wearing clothes that had not encountered the kind of work that produced the dust Caleb was currently standing in. The man dismounted at the gate with the manner of someone accustomed to having his arrival noted. Agnes came out. "Help you," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He touched his hat. "Name's Tom Reeves. I manage the Stone Ranch operation out of Santa Fe. I'm looking for the owner of record, a Mr. Caleb Stone. His legal representatives have indicated he may be traveling through this region." Caleb did not move. He kept his back turned and his hands on the fence post, not working, just holding it as if assessing where the next nail needed to go. "What does he look like?" Agnes asked. "That's the thing, ma'am. I've never met him in person. 4 years on the job, everything through correspondence and legal counsel. From what I understand, he's about 55, hair going gray. There's one thing people who've seen him remember. He has a habit of working at the inner lining of his boot collar with his fingers when he's thinking. His own attorney's wife mentioned it once, and apparently it stays in the mind." Caleb was very still. He was aware with the particular full-body awareness that comes in moments of genuine consequence that his right hand was inside his right boot collar. Had been for the last 2 minutes without his having noticed. He lowered it slowly and put it flat against his thigh. "Eli," Agnes called. "Come out here a moment." He turned and walked toward them with the posture of a man who has nothing in particular on his mind. Tom Reeves looked at him the way people look at hired labor. The rapid processing, the categorization, the dismissal. Nothing in Reeves's expression suggested that the man in front of him bore any relationship to the man he was looking for. "You know anyone by the name of Stone?" Agnes asked Caleb. "No, ma'am," he said. "Never heard of him." Reeves nodded, accepting this. "One other thing," he said, turning back to Agnes. "We've had some trouble at Bear Creek. The main control valve at the water station has been opened. Water's flowing back toward the lower valley, which is not where it's contracted to flow. If you see or hear anything about who might have gone up there, I'll let you know," Agnes said. Reeves thanked her, remounted, and rode back up the track. Agnes waited until the sound of hooves had diminished to nothing. Then she turned and looked at Caleb. She looked at his face for a moment. Then she looked down slowly and with purpose at his boots. At the crease along the collar of the right one, where a man's fingers work at the inner lining without his being aware that they are doing it. Then she looked back up. Her gray eyes were steady and gave nothing away, which was he was beginning to understand not the absence of feeling, but its full containment. Supper at 6, she said. She went back inside. That was all. But it was not nothing. He understood with the certainty that comes from paying close enough attention to someone over enough days that the pause before she went in was not an oversight. That she had looked at his boot collar and she had looked at his face and she had made a connection between the two pieces of information, and that connection had arrived at a destination that her face was not at this moment prepared to announce. He went back to the fence. He worked until the light was gone. That night was the night. He lay on the straw in the stable as he had lain on 20 previous nights. But this night was different from all of them. The decision had been present in him since March of 1886, gathering weight for 3 years, and it had arrived at a mass he could no longer carry without it changing the shape of him. He thought about the doctor saying end of summer, into fall if she was lucky. He thought about Daniel turning the knife in his hands and saying, don't be one more person who leaves. He thought about the envelope in the Bible and the way Agnes had knelt in the dirt between the tomato plants on the first afternoon with a nearly empty watering can. He thought about the 40% reduction in natural flow, the paperwork he had signed without reading, the key he had carried for 3 years as a form of penance that cost him nothing because it never required him to actually do anything. He thought about the people in that lower valley who had not had the option of carrying their difficulties in their pockets and deferring them indefinitely. He had been telling himself for 3 years that the right moment had not arrived yet, that he needed to think through the implications, that there were legal complexities, that the drought was primarily a natural event and attribution was not straightforward. He had been lying, not in the dramatic way, in the ordinary and much more common way, which is the way a person constructs a sufficient number of reasonable-sounding explanations for not doing a difficult thing until the explanations feel like reasons. The truth was simple. He had been afraid, not of legal consequences, not of financial exposure, afraid of having to stand in front of the specific human cost of a decision he had made carelessly and see it and have it see him. He got up. He saddled the mare in the dark without a lamp, moving by feel and habit, and the particular spatial memory that develops when a person has been in and out of the same space many times at different levels of visibility. The mare stood steady. She had the patience of an old animal that has seen enough to understand that most things are manageable if you stand still and wait for them to pass. He led her out quietly across the packed earth of the yard, around the side, away from the house, and onto the track before he mounted. 3 miles north on the old utility line to the Bear Creek control station. The desert at 2 in the morning was not what people who have not experienced it tend to imagine. It was not silent. It was full of sound, the sounds of small things going about their business, insects and night birds, and the distant complaint of something larger moving through brush. The stars were excessive, the way desert stars always are, more of them than any reasonable sky ought to hold, and they gave enough light to navigate by without needing anything else. He did not think about what he was doing. He had thought about it enough. He rode. The control station was a low wooden building over the valve housing, functional and plain, the kind of structure built to serve a purpose without any interest in being noticed. The padlock on the door was good iron, not decorative. His key turned it without resistance. Inside it smelled of old metal and underground water and the particular darkness that accumulates in places that are opened rarely. He found the main control wheel by feel and by the memory of the schematics he had reviewed when the diversion was installed. He stood for a moment before he gripped it. He thought about the authorization document. The way it had sat in a bundle with 19 other papers, each one representing some decision or commitment or transfer, the whole stack amounting to a Tuesday afternoon's work, a routine review, a series of signatures. He had been 49 years old. He had been building an empire with the confidence of a man who had been right more often than he had been wrong, and the confidence had made him careless in the particular way that confidence does when it stops being earned and becomes assumed. He gripped the wheel and turned. It resisted. The mechanism had been in one position for 3 years and had opinions about staying there.